So this is a joint work with Itai Abraham, Neil Jiridaran, and Kartik Nayak. And this work actually started more than 2 years ago when 3 of the authors were still at VMware Research. So hopefully that's an indication that we put a lot of thoughts in this model. I have been thinking about this problem way longer than 2 years. Right, so, oops. That's the right one. All right. So as you already seen, there are 3 mainstream timing models, right, that almost every consensus protocol is going to choose one from these 3, right? Synchrony, asynchrony, and partial synchrony. Right? They describe our assumptions on message delays. Right? Strictly speaking, they also describe our assumption on clock skews, but for convenience and simplicity, let me just ignore that and we'll focus on message delays. Right? So synchrony says there is a known upper bound on the delay of every single message. Asynchrony says there's no such bound, and partial synchrony says sometimes there is and sometimes there is not. Right? And so why do we want a new model? Well, the one common reason is that we run out of papers to write in the old models. Right? So now we can redo everything we did in the past 4 or 5 decades. Right? Well, there's some element of that, but hopefully I'll be able to convince you that this is a natural model and a valuable model that you should care about and you should start adopting it in your works. All right, so the real reason is that I believe that existing models are either too strong or too weak. Right? In particular, synchrony is too strong, and I think that many people agree with that. Right? So about maybe 8 years ago, when I first started working on consensus, I worked on a bunch of synchronous protocols, right? And back then we got a lot of pushback. Right? Every time we submit, there's one reviewer that always said synchrony is completely ridiculous, right? That you should never use it. Right. Indeed, there's some truth to that. Right? The synchrony assumption says every single message takes no more than delta to arrive. Right. So if you have a single message that takes longer than delta, we are forced to consider either the sender or the recipient to be faulty, right? And that eats into our fault tolerance. Right? And if every party sometimes has a slow message delivery, then everybody is faulty, right? Then our protocol, the model doesn't hold, and protocols do not provide any provable guarantees, right? And at the time, partial synchrony and asynchrony are considered gold standard, right? The mainstream models, most protocols adopt them. But with the boom of blockchains, I would argue that at least sometimes they are too weak. Right. So first of all, you will have to sacrifice your fault tolerance. Right. They partial synchrony or asynchrony. And by the way, I'm treating them mostly the same because the spirits are very close in those 2 models. Right. You can only tolerate less than half crashes or less than 1/3 Byzantine. Right. Whereas if you're willing to assume synchrony, you can tolerate any number of crashes and half Byzantine. And you can arguably sometimes 1/3 is too low a threshold. Right? We've seen in blockchain systems where the biggest guy sometimes does control close to 1/3 or even more than 1/3 of the voting power or stake and what have you. So yeah, that's the first reason I would argue it's too weak, too pessimistic. Right? And another reason is that dynamic participation is simply impossible in these models, right? And most of the deployed protocols, blockchain protocols, including Bitcoin, do provide dynamic participation, right? So they would fail miserably in partial synchrony or asynchrony, right? And just a quick anecdote, right? I think, again, many years ago, there was some misconception, right? That many people believe Bitcoin is asynchronous or partially synchronous. I think the logic went as follows. Right? Synchrony is bad, partial synchrony is good. Bitcoin is good, therefore Bitcoin is partially synchronous, right? I spent many years trying to correct that misconception. And now I'm happy to see that most people agree that Bitcoin is not partially synchronous, right? But I'm starting to see the opposite misconception that Bitcoin is synchronous, right? That's not what I advocate, right? Indeed, I myself wrote several papers, right? Juan Gray wrote a classic paper that proved Bitcoin is secure in synchrony. That doesn't mean that's the only model that Bitcoin is securing, right? So here is the picture, right? On one hand, we have synchrony and asynchrony that are very secure, but maybe too pessimistic. Synchrony is a stronger model, right? But there is a large gap in between, right? That possibly the right model, right, or the model that Bitcoin implicitly adopts, even though nobody knows what that model is, right, is somewhere in between, right? And that's what I'm trying to achieve with this work, right? We hope to fill that void with a new model we call granular synchrony, right? And you see that I made it cover the full space, because this is a parameterizable model that there is a slider you can turn that you can make it degenerate to synchrony in one of the extreme and make it degenerate to partial synchrony or asynchrony in the other extreme, okay? So this is somewhat of a simplification, right? Because it's not a single dimension, right? You cannot totally order all the models. Right? In fact, our final model is incomparable to partial synchrony. Right? It is stronger than partial synchrony in some ways, but weaker in other ways. Okay, so very quickly, some existing works that are related, but not quite, right? Because there's mobile sluggish, sleepy, but these are node failures. Right? They're not really talking about network communication links, right? And they still have to assume one of the timing model, and in that case, it's synchrony, right? And there are many works on incomplete communication graphs or lossy links where messages can get lost. That's also orthogonal, right? Because all three timing models, including the one and then one new one I'm proposing, we assume that messages do arrive, right? They are not lossy. Right? So even if you assume some messages can be lost, for the remaining messages that do arrive, you still need a timing model, right? And existing works will still have to choose one among the three mainstream ones. Lastly, there are some works that study the minimum synchrony assumption to circumvent this FOP impossibility. Right? So they will be models that fall between asynchrony and partial synchrony. Right? That's not where I'm focusing on. Right? I'm mostly taking the position that even partial synchrony is too pessimistic. But their methodology is very similar to what we're going to do. Right? We're going to assume the network is a graph consisting of different types of links. Right? In particular, for us, it will be a graph consisting of all three types of links, synchrony. Some links are synchronous, some links are partially synchronous, and some links are asynchronous. Okay? And for now, we assume the graph is undirected, meaning that if I have a synchronous link to you, then you also have a synchronous link to me, right? We don't consider asymmetric network behaviors for now. Okay, so and also to start, I will assume there are no asynchronous links, right? Just to make things a little simpler, right? We have a network that's consisting of a mixture of synchronous links and partially synchronous links that will put our model in terms of strength strictly in between synchrony and partial synchrony. Okay, but later when we add back asynchronous edges, then you will see that this becomes incomparable to partial synchrony, right? Because we have some synchronous links and some asynchronous links, right, that are both stronger and weaker than partial synchrony. Yeah, question?
We consider only async and asynchrony, so no partial synchrony, just mixing between those two.
We can consider that. I didn't in this talk for now, but yeah, maybe future work. Okay, so then fault tolerance, right? That's the main thing we want to do. We want to get beyond the fault tolerance of partial synchrony. right? In fact, we do achieve that. We can tolerate more than half crashes, right? And we can tolerate more than 1/3 crashes, right? And this is really as expected, right? So our fault tolerance can be in between the fault tolerance for synchrony and the fault tolerance of partial synchrony, right? And will be a slider that you can use to make it anywhere on that spectrum.
Is which flavor known to the participants?
Yeah, good question. The protocols we design will not know it. So it's graph agnostic in that sense, right? So the main task that we take on is to identify the necessary and sufficient graph condition, right, where consensus is solvable for a given pair of N and F. Right? And we're focusing on deterministic algorithms for now, but really there's no reason that, other than just for convenience, right, as the first paper in this space. Okay, and yeah, I'll also comment that most of the time, whenever we can, right, we always give algorithms that are graph agnostic, right, meaning that the algorithm doesn't know which link is behave which way, right? But when we prove the negative result, when we prove no algorithm exists, most of the time we are proving that no algorithm exists, right? Even ones that are tailored to the particular graph, right, that nothing can work.
They also don't know the fraction.
They do know the fraction, right? It's for a given pair of N and F. It doesn't know that. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's see. So the first variant would be, which would be the simplest variant. Let's consider crash faults and no asynchronous links. And then we can show that consensus is solvable if and only if, regardless of which up to F nodes crash, we cannot find two disjoint groups, right, that are both size n minus f or larger, such that there's no synchronous path across them. Okay, so I'm really saying something very simple, right? That the adversary will win, right? And no algorithm can exist if there is a way to identify up to F nodes, right? Crash them, and then we're left with two isolated groups, right, that are not connected by synchronous paths, right? And they're only connected by potentially partially synchronous links that can take a very long time to deliver messages, right? Because, and it should be fairly easy to see why, if the adversary can do this, then consensus is not solvable, right? Because you just corrupt that middle group, right? This left group is N minus F, which is big enough, right? It's supposed to make a decision. From this left group's perspective, the situation could have been that everybody else crashed, right? They are the only one doing things, right? So they need to make a decision, but the same applies to the right group. Now you have two groups that both need to make a decision, but they cannot communicate to each other timely, so they will have to make independent decisions, and that will violate agreement, right?
So for which F does this make sense? Like if you have F1/4, then you require this three-quarter. Like
yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll answer that in a minute. Okay. So, well, you're probably familiar with these numbers, but it may be a little hard to think about them because I'm in a different regime than what's usual, right? N minus F is actually a very small number, right? Let's see, N is 1.6 F, right? Less than 2 F, right? So N minus F is actually smaller than F, right? Okay.
These three sets are not disjoint.
Mm-hmm.
These three sets are not disjoint.
What do you mean disjoint? That there are no nodes that in both?
Yeah.
I
guess if you add them up, you get maybe.
Yeah. So okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if I want to get into that, but it's never in crash case. It's actually interesting that it's not in the adversary's interest to crash F nodes, right? Because if you crash F nodes, then you will never be able to find two such large groups, right? So if, for example, here the right thing to do for the adversary is to crop a few nodes, right? Then so there are victims left, right? So that's very interesting because in the Byzantine case, you will, as we'll see, that we don't have to do that up to F because it's always in the adversary's interest to corrupt maximum that they can, right? So this is what's called the split brain attack, right? That if the split brain attack can work, then there's no way to solve consensus. Okay. And the next thing I want to draw your attention to is that this condition is a natural unifying framework for synchrony and partial synchrony, right? So let's see. So if we're in standard synchrony where every single edge is synchronous, then you will never be able to find two groups that are not connected by synchronous path, right? So then this condition always holds. Consensus is always solvable, right? So then that matches the classic result that in synchrony, you can tolerate any number of crash faults. Right? Okay. Whereas now if every link is partially synchronous, right, then as long as you can find two groups, they will not have a synchronous path in between, right? So the only thing that can save us is to play with N and F such that you will never be able to find two large groups, right? That would require N to be greater than 2F, right? Such that N minus F is greater than half of the nodes, right? Then of course you cannot find two groups of N minus F, right? So as you can see, the model degenerates to synchrony on one extreme and degenerates to partial synchrony on the other extreme, right? And if you have N and F that's in the middle of those two extremes, then this is the necessary and sufficient condition for solving consensus. Okay. Now let's see the Byzantine case. Right, it's actually fairly similar. Right, consensus is solvable if and only if, regardless of which F Byzantine nodes, F nodes you corrupt to be Byzantine, you cannot find two disjoint groups of size n minus 2F on its nodes, right, that are not linked by synchronous path. Right. So here is an example. Right. Once again, it's the same reason as before, right? Because if you can do this, then this left group is n minus 2F. Right? This middle group is Byzantine. It can behave towards the left group in one way, but behave towards the other group in another way, right? Basically play in double agents, right? So then this left group can believe that we are in a situation where the right group has crashed, right? Then they are everybody, so they need to make a decision, right? But same thing for the right one, right? The right group together with the middle Byzantine group, they need to make a decision, right? And these two are independent decisions by honest people, right? That will violate consensus.
So this holds even assuming PKI.
Yeah, this holds even assuming PKI. Mm-hmm. Right, so that's again the split brain attack in the Byzantine case. I can also check this is unifying synchrony and partial synchrony as two extremes. Right? Yeah, okay. On the one hand, n has to be greater than 2F, right? Even in a synchrony case. Right? On the other extreme, if we're in partial synchrony, there's no synchronous path whatsoever, right? Then the only way is to have n that's big enough such that you will never be able to find two disjoint large groups, right? So n equals 3F plus 1 is the minimum value that makes that happen. Okay. So next, so I've shown you why these conditions are necessary, right? So then let me try to give you some intuition why these conditions are sufficient, right? I won't be, well, we gave protocols that solve consensus, establishing they're sufficient, right? I can't tell you the entire protocol, but I'll just give you the meat of the protocol, right? So let me take a step back and give you a very rough recap of how partially synchronous protocols work, right? Pretty much they all follow this paradigm, right? If there's one decision, a decision requires n minus f votes, right? So if there is a decision, then there are n minus f votes for that decision, right? And they also require a node to lock on the decision if you vote for it, right? Lock is kind of like a solved decision, right? So now n minus f locked on that decision, n minus 2f of those are honest, okay? Now the main concern for partially synchronous protocol is that later there comes a new leader with a new proposal, right? If it's unaware that somebody decided, then we're in trouble, right? So the way they get around that is to require that a new proposal must carry n minus f locks, right? The new leader needs to ask ask everybody, what locks do you currently have, right? And attach them in its new proposal, right? Then this n minus f and this n minus 2f, they intersect. That's what we call quorum intersection. They intersect at least one node if n is greater than 3f plus 1, right? N is at least 3f plus 1, right? So that intersection, that one node intersection will make sure that whatever decision that has been made is reproposed in the new proposal, okay? Now we are in the n less than, right, or less than or equal to 3f region, so we cannot make that argument. Right? N minus 2f and n minus f, they may not intersect, right? Right. So the main idea is that we will have to upgrade this n minus 2f quorum to a bigger quorum of size f plus 1. Right? Whenever we have n minus 2f honest with the lock, we'll have to do something to make sure f plus 1 people have that lock, right? So then we can invoke the intersection argument, n minus f and f plus 1 intersect at one node, okay? Right, so we'll have to use our graph condition to make this happen, right? And that graph condition basically says exactly that, right? Let's see. So let's say the adversary corrupts a certain f, right? Now let's pick an arbitrary n minus 2f honest nodes, right? Some nodes are disconnected from them, right? But how large is that right group? Right? It must be less than n minus 2f, right? Otherwise, we violated the condition, right? So now this is less than n minus 2f, here f nodes, right? So there must be more nodes that are here connecting to this left group, right? So these two groups together definitely exceed f nodes, right? They're at least f plus 1, right? And that's exactly what we said we need, right? Any n minus 2f on its nodes are synchronously connected to f plus 1 nodes. So you just give them a little more time, they will propagate their locks to a larger group, right? And that larger group intersect with n minus f. Okay, right? That's basically how we're going to design our algorithms. Right? There are many steps that we need to make sure this intersection happens. Right? That's always what we do. Okay, I have some quick additional remarks. The algorithms we design do not need to know the graph. The conditions are necessary even for graph-tailored algorithms most of the time. Right? So I had one big concern about this model. Right? That is, how do we check if this condition holds? Right? It sounds like I'll have to go out and every link and measure it, evaluate it, right, and decide whether it's a synchronous, partially synchronous, or asynchronous link. And then I draw the graph. I'll check every set. Right? It seems very unrealistic to do that. right? But my current opinion is that that's not a problem because we don't, right? We just assume it, right? And it's not very different from what we're currently doing, right? Because think about it, right? Right now we assume the adversary cannot corrupt more than F nodes, right? Why do we believe that? We never go out and interview each of the nodes, right? And what's your motivation? What's your financial ties? Who may you collude, right? And then make an evaluation whether it's believable that that adversary can at most corrupt F nodes, right? We never did that. We just assume that's the case, right? If it holds, great. If it doesn't hold, then we're screwed. But that's life, right? We couldn't do better. Right? So there's an alternative interpretation of the model, right? Which is the system designer just picks N and F, right? And deploys one of the granular synchrony protocols and just hope that the adversary cannot violate the condition. Right? The adversary can corrupt nodes, can slow down links, but it's just assumed to be incapable of creating two large groups such that their intergroup delay is longer than some threshold, right? We'll just assume that's the case. If the assumption holds, great, our protocol works. If the assumption doesn't hold, then we're screwed. But that's the best we could have done, right? There's nothing could have saved us anyway. Right? So I would argue that we're not in a much worse position than we're currently in. Okay. Okay. How much time do I have? Okay. So I'll very quickly mention what happens after we add back asynchronous links. Right now, we will have two conditions. Right, the previous condition is still required, and then we have a new condition. Right, that's not our focus, but it's an interesting byproduct of our work. Right, the interesting part is that we can, if we assume f is less than half n, right? So now the first condition always holds, so we can just delete it, right? And now we are basically answering the question, what's the minimum synchrony assumption required to circumvent the FLP impossibility, right? And that's a classic problem that has been studied for a very long time, right? At least for 2 decades and a couple of papers. It turns out they conjecture the condition is this thing called F source, right? Which is different from the condition we found, right? And turns out this is a stronger condition than what we require, right? So that kind of disproves that conjecture, right? And the tight condition really is this one, right? But the Byzantine case is more complicated than graph agnostically. The prior work is correct. Indeed, the condition is F source, but for graph tailored algorithm, we actually don't know what's the necessary condition. All right, so yeah, quickly summarize. So I presented the granular synchrony model, right? It does a bunch of things that we set out to do, right? It is weaker than synchrony. It tolerates more faults. Right? It's natural and unifying model for different timing assumptions, right? And we mostly identified the tight conditions, right? But I didn't deliver all my promises in the beginning, right? I don't know whether this model supports dynamic participation. Right? I don't know whether it captures what Bitcoin requires. Right? So there's more work to do. Right? Hopefully more papers to write.